If you think cartoons are harmless, you've never seen what I found. I used to laugh at the idea that anything made for kids could be dangerous. Bright colors, silly jokes, a sponge flipping Krabby Patties underwater. What's the worst that could happen? But what I stumbled across wasn't meant to entertain children. It wasn't even meant to be seen by anyone at all. It's strange, really. We grow up believing cartoons are safe little escapes, locked in a bubble of innocence. They're the background noise of childhood, the warm glow of the TV on Saturday mornings, the comfort food of an entire generation. That's what I thought when I first laid eyes on the old tape. Nostalgia, familiarity, a harmless piece of the past. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was something darker, something that had been deliberately hidden. You can tell when something was meant to be forgotten. The tape didn't just look old. It looked condemned, like it carried weight, like it shouldn't be touched. I didn't listen to that instinct. Curiosity has always been my downfall. The label on the cassette was scratched half off, the kind of thing that makes you lean closer, squinting to make out the faint markings. The only letters I could recognize were SB, a faded, jagged scrawl, like someone wrote it in a hurry, or like they didn't want to be remembered for writing it at all. My first thought was obvious: SpongeBob. I should have laughed it off. I should have put it back in the dusty bin where I found it and walked away. But something about it pulled at me, like a hook under the skin. SpongeBob had always been lighthearted, ridiculous, harmless. And yet, holding that tape, I felt anything but safe. People talk about lost episodes as if they're myths, creepypasta fuel, nothing more. But here's the thing about myths. Sometimes they start with something real. And when you're the one who finds that something, you don't get to laugh about it anymore. I thought I was uncovering a piece of forgotten television history. I thought maybe I'd find a weird pilot, a shelved idea, something I could show off as a novelty. Instead, I unearthed something that was never supposed to see the light of day. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why I wish I never pressed play. When I was a kid, SpongeBob wasn't just a show, it was a ritual. I can still remember the glow of the TV spilling across the living room floor, the faint hum of the old cable box, and the way the opening theme would instantly pull me in. "Are you ready, kids?" I'd shout. "Aye, aye, Captain," even when no one else was around to hear. It wasn't just entertainment. It was comfort. SpongeBob was a world where nothing truly bad could happen. Even when things went wrong, when Squidward snapped, when Plankton plotted, everything always reset to normal by the end of the episode. That was the magic of it. Safe chaos. A guarantee that laughter would return no matter what. In those years, cartoons felt like shields. Watching them, you felt untouchable, invincible. Life outside might have been messy. Homework piling up, bullies lurking on the playground, parents arguing in the kitchen. But Bikini Bottom was always there, waiting with a joke and a song. It's hard to describe how powerful that kind of comfort can be to a child. It wasn't just TV, it was sanctuary. That's why I couldn't shake the unease when I first picked up that tape. SpongeBob, to me, had always meant brightness. But the object in my hand carried a different weight, like the shadow of something rotten hiding behind a smile. Back then, I'd heard whispers online. If you spent enough time on forums, you'd stumble across threads about lost episodes. They always had names like Squidward's Suicide or The Grinning Sponge, strange and grotesque legends that nobody could ever prove were real. They were the kind of stories people traded in late-night chat rooms, half believing, half laughing, daring each other to find clips that never seemed to exist. I used to scroll through those posts with a mix of amusement and skepticism. Creepy fan theories, I thought. Fabricated nightmares for internet thrill seekers. They were entertaining to read, but I never gave them weight. A show like SpongeBob couldn't hold that kind of darkness. It was like imagining a knife hidden in a balloon. Ridiculous, impossible. Still, I remember the way some people wrote about them, with this raw conviction that felt different from casual trolling. They weren't laughing, they were warning. They'd say things like, "If you ever see the tape, don't watch it." I'd dismiss those words, scroll past, and tell myself it was just another game of online telephone, an urban legend for a new generation. And then I found myself holding a physical tape with SB etched into it. Suddenly, the whispers didn't feel so funny anymore. They felt like echoes of something real. I can't explain why my chest tightened when I ran my thumb across the label, or why my hands trembled slightly, as if some part of me already knew I wasn't supposed to be touching it. Maybe it was the culmination of those years of hearing about cursed cartoons and forbidden episodes. Maybe it was something else entirely. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of the tape being fake. It was the possibility of it being real. Because if even one of those online legends was true, if even one of those cursed episodes actually existed, then the boundary between innocence and horror wasn't as solid as I thought. And if SpongeBob, the ultimate symbol of comfort, could be corrupted, then what else could? I tried to laugh it off, to shake away the feeling gnawing at my stomach. After all, I was older now, no longer that kid clutching a bowl of cereal in front of the TV. I told myself I was being ridiculous, projecting childhood fears onto a piece of dusty plastic. But the unease never left. It lingered, stubborn and sharp, like a splinter under the skin. For years, I thought lost episodes were nothing but campfire stories for the internet age. Creepy fabrications with no teeth. I always thought it was just an urban legend until I held one in my hands. The tape didn't come to me in some dramatic way. There was no bloodstained package left on my doorstep, no anonymous email with a cursed link. It was simpler than that, and maybe that's why it unsettled me so much. Horror doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, tucked between junk no one else bothers to notice. I'd been killing time at a thrift store. You know the kind, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, dusty racks of clothes that smelled faintly of mildew, boxes of forgotten trinkets stacked against the walls. It was the kind of place where nostalgia goes to die. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just flipping through old VHS tapes in a plastic bin marked 50 cents each. Most of them were predictable. Workout tapes from the 90s, half-worn Disney knockoffs, old sitcom box sets nobody wanted. And then I saw it. A black cassette wedged sideways at the bottom of the pile, its label peeling at the edges. The first thing I noticed was how heavy it felt in my hands. Heavier than the others, like it had been soaking up years of dust and secrets. The sticker on the side was yellowed, sticky to the touch, with a faint smear of something dark along the corner. Coffee, I told myself, though it didn't look like coffee. The handwriting on the label stopped me cold. Jagged letters scrawled in permanent marker. SB 129. If you're a SpongeBob fan, that code means something. SB 129 is the title of an early episode, the one where Squidward gets frozen in the freezer and wakes up in the future. A harmless, silly episode about time travel. But the way it was written on this tape, it didn't look official. It looked rushed, desperate, like whoever wrote it wanted it out of their hands as quickly as possible. I remember standing there, tape in hand, when my friend Marcus came up behind me. "Dude, you're not actually gonna buy that, are you?" he asked, his voice sharp with the kind of unease you don't usually hear from him. "Why not?" I said, trying to sound casual, though my stomach was twisting. "It's just an old SpongeBob tape." He gave me this look, a mix of disbelief and irritation. "That's not worth the trouble, man. Stuff like that. There's a reason it ends up in a place like this. Some things you don't bring home." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. Marcus was the kind of guy who lived on Reddit horror threads, the type who could recite creepypastas like bedtime stories. Usually he'd be the one pushing me to buy something like this, not warning me away. His seriousness only made the tape feel heavier in my hands. "Relax," I told him, slipping it into the crook of my arm with the other tapes I'd picked up. "What's the worst that could happen? It doesn't play? Big deal." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the unease. Something about the way the letters were scrawled, the way the tape seemed out of place. Like it wasn't meant to be in that bin, or in this store, or even in my hands. I paid the cashier, shoved the tape into a plastic bag, and tried to ignore the way Marcus muttered, "You'll regret it," under his breath. On the way home, I kept sneaking glances at it in the passenger seat. The label caught the light differently than the others, almost glossy in spots, like it had been wet recently. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed, though I couldn't have told you why. It's funny how curiosity works. It doesn't whisper, it gnaws. I told myself a dozen reasons not to play it. Bad tape, wasted time, Marcus's warning. But underneath it all, another thought kept pushing to the surface. What if this is real? What if all those whispers online about lost episodes had some truth to them? What if I was holding proof in my hands? Proof of something that wasn't supposed to exist. The idea of it being just another bootleg recording or some fan-made nonsense didn't scare me. What scared me was the possibility that it wasn't nonsense at all. That this was the thing people warned about in hushed tones. The story buried in forum archives. The tape passed from hand to hand like contraband. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the decision had already been made. I told myself I was just curious, just testing it out. But the truth was simpler, more dangerous. I had to know. Something about the way it was labeled felt wrong, and I couldn't stop myself from pressing play. I slid the tape into the VCR and pressed the worn plastic button with more hesitation than I'd like to admit. The machine gave its usual mechanical groan, swallowing the cassette, and for a few seconds the screen was nothing but black. Then a burst of static exploded, a white noise crackle that seemed to shake the room. And then, there it was. The familiar ukulele strum, the cheerful whistle of the SpongeBob theme song. A wave of relief washed over me. For a second, I laughed at myself. This was just another episode. All that build-up, all that dread, it was nothing. "Are you ready, kids?" The voice boomed, as it always did. But the kids' chorus didn't follow. There was only silence. I frowned, leaning forward. The opening sequence continued, SpongeBob in his little white shirt, his tie bouncing as he giggled and waved. But the audio was wrong. The ukulele was slightly warped, dragging a fraction of a second behind the visuals. It was subtle, but enough to make my skin prickle. Still, I told myself it was just tape damage. Old VHS tapes degrade like that all the time. I'd seen glitches, warping, color bleeding before. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural. The title card flashed onto the screen. SB 129. I almost chuckled. Exactly what was written on the label. Maybe it really was just a recording of that Squidward time travel episode. The episode began with Squidward, clarinet in hand, complaining about SpongeBob's laughter echoing through the walls. Standard fare. I relaxed a little, letting the nostalgia carry me back. But then the laugh track kicked in. Not the usual, goofy, Ken laughter. This one was distorted, like someone had slowed it down, dragged it out until it sounded less like laughter and more like wheezing. It rose and fell unevenly, like an old man struggling to catch his breath. I tried to brush it off, but my body reacted before my brain did. Goosebumps along my arms, a tightening in my chest. It was wrong, in a way I couldn't rationalize. As the episode continued, the oddities multiplied. SpongeBob's movements were just a little too jerky, as though a frame or two were missing in every step. His eyes lingered on Squidward longer than they should, unblinking, pupils too dilated. At one point, he looked straight at the camera for a solid 3 seconds before snapping back to Squidward with his trademark giggle. I paused the tape, heart pounding, and told myself again that it was just degradation. But the pause screen was worse. SpongeBob's eyes froze directly on mine, wide and glassy, his teeth bared in something that looked more like a grimace than a smile. I hit play again, almost out of panic, needing the image to move, to breathe again. The story followed the usual beats. Squidward storms off, locks himself in the freezer, gets frozen by accident. But even the freezer scene was off. When the ice spread over him, the sound it made wasn't cartoonish or playful. It was sharp, cracking, like real ice fracturing under pressure. I swear I heard Squidward mutter something under his breath, but it was too low to make out. Then came the time travel sequence. In the real episode, Squidward wakes up in the future, greeted by chrome walls and cheerful SpongeBob descendants. In this version, the future was silent. The background was just a gray void stretching endlessly, static crawling at the edges of the frame. Squidward called out. No one answered. His voice echoed, distorted, like it was bouncing through a cavern instead of a cartoon background. The camera followed him as he walked through the void. And that's when I heard it. A sound in the background. As the episode continued, the oddities multiplied. SpongeBob's movements were just a little too jerky, as though a frame or two were missing in every step. His eyes lingered on Squidward longer than they should, unblinking, pupils too dilated. At one point, he looked straight at the camera for a solid 3 seconds before snapping back to Squidward with his trademark giggle. I paused the tape, heart pounding, and told myself again that it was just degradation. But the pause screen was worse. SpongeBob's eyes froze directly on mine, wide and glassy, his teeth bared in something that looked more like a grimace than a smile. I hit play again, almost out of panic, needing the image to move, to breathe again. The story followed the usual beats. Squidward storms off, locks himself in the freezer, gets frozen by accident. But even the freezer scene was off. When the ice spread over him, the sound it made wasn't cartoonish or playful. It was sharp, cracking, like real ice fracturing under pressure. I swear I heard Squidward mutter something under his breath, but it was too low to make out. Then came the time travel sequence. In the real episode, Squidward wakes up in the future, greeted by chrome walls and cheerful SpongeBob descendants. In this version, the future was silent. The background was just a gray void stretching endlessly, static crawling at the edges of the frame. Squidward called out. No one answered. His voice echoed, distorted, like it was bouncing through a cavern instead of a cartoon background. The camera followed him as he walked through the void. And that's when I heard it. A sound in the background. Except it wasn't the bright, playful city I knew. The colors were drained, sickly gray and brown, like it had been rotting underwater for centuries. The buildings leaned crookedly, some half collapsed. The streets were littered with debris I couldn't quite identify. Shards, bones, scraps of things too twisted to name. And worst of all was the silence. No laughter, no music, no seagulls. Just the faint buzz of static, like the sound was bleeding through from another world. SpongeBob appeared first, standing at the center of the frame. His body was hunched, his eyes glassy. When he opened his mouth to speak, the voice that came out wasn't Tom Kenny's cheerful tone. It was lower, rasping, as though someone was forcing words through waterlogged lungs. "They won't laugh anymore," he whispered. The words didn't make sense. They weren't funny, weren't even remotely in character. But they carried a weight that pressed on me, made my stomach knot. The camera panned to Squidward. His face looked wrong. His features were exaggerated, sagging like melted wax. His eyes twitched in random directions, pupils dilating and contracting unnaturally. He lifted his clarinet, but instead of music, a sharp screech burst out, high-pitched enough to make me wince and cover my ears. Then Patrick appeared. At first he looked normal, just standing in the background with his vacant grin. But as the camera tried to focus on him, his body glitched. Static swallowed him in patches, cutting in and out like a corrupted file. His grin widened, stretched far past his cheeks, and then snapped back to normal. The glitching grew worse every time the camera returned to him, until his body was nothing but flickering fragments barely held together. "Patrick," SpongeBob whispered, turning his head in slow, jerky movements. "Patrick, don't go." Patrick's voice came out garbled, broken into syllables that didn't form words. The sound was distorted, half human, half electronic, like a voice passing through a corrupted modem. And underneath it all, I swore I could hear screams, faint, layered beneath the distortion, as if real voices were trapped inside the glitch. The camera shifted again, showing more of Bikini Bottom. The once colorful houses were now cracked husks. The Krusty Krab was boarded up, its sign half buried in sand. In the distance, I could make out outlines hanging from lamp posts, silhouettes swaying gently, their details hidden in the haze. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was some fan edit, some grim parody. But the animation was too fluid, too precise. It wasn't the clumsy work of an amateur. It felt official, as though the same hands that made the real SpongeBob had also made this. The camera zoomed in on Squidward. His eyes filled the screen, bloodshot veins spiderwebbing across the whites. He whispered something, his lips trembling. At first I couldn't make it out, but after replaying the sound in my head, I realized what he'd said. Make it stop. The words were soft, but they weren't a line meant for viewers. They sounded desperate, like a plea, like Squidward himself was aware of what was happening. My chest tightened. I wanted to look away, but the screen held me captive. SpongeBob shuffled closer to Squidward, muttering again. This time, his words were incoherent, wet sounds spilling from his mouth like he was choking on them. I leaned in, straining to catch even a single phrase. But all I caught were fragments. They see you, and keep watching. The background noise grew louder. Not music, never music, but something that sounded like dozens of voices layered together. Whispers, moans, cries, all overlapping until they became a single, endless drone. And then the gore started. It wasn't sudden, not like a cheap jump scare. It crept in. SpongeBob's body twitched, his sponge flesh tearing slightly at the edges, revealing something underneath. Not bones, sponges don't have bones, but something dark, fibrous, pulsing. Black fluid oozed from the corners of his mouth as he whispered. The camera panned across Bikini Bottom again, and now the silhouettes were clearer. They weren't props. They weren't vague shadows. They were characters. Familiar ones. Mr. Krabs, his shell cracked and leaking. Sandy, her suit shattered, helmet filled with water. Even Pearl, hanging limp, her whale body grotesque against the backdrop of decay. My stomach churned. Squidward fell to his knees, covering his face. His sobs weren't cartoonish, weren't exaggerated. They sounded real, raw, human, breaking. The screen flickered, and Patrick reappeared, his glitching worse than before. His body broke apart into pixels and static, only to reform in increasingly grotesque ways. At one point, his star-shaped body stretched into something long and thin, a shadow reaching toward the screen before snapping back with a crackle. I whispered to myself, "Stop. Just stop." But the tape didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, SpongeBob's body continued to tear, and Squidward's sobbing filled the silence between. I should have turned it off. I should have ejected the tape and smashed it into pieces. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something in me needed to see more, needed to understand what I was watching, even if it destroyed me. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The tape didn't just want to be watched. It wanted to be remembered. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glow of the screen, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The horror was only beginning. The static rose again, thick and violent, swallowing the frame in jagged flashes. For a moment, I thought the tape had finally reached its breaking point. But then, through the chaos, an image began to emerge. It wasn't SpongeBob, not at first. It was faces. Faces of sea creatures I didn't recognize. Not the cheerful, stylized ones from the show, but grotesque, elongated shapes pressed up against the screen as though they were trapped inside. Their mouths opened and closed without sound, their eyes hollow and pleading. Each time the static cleared, a different face appeared, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, layered over one another, overlapping like a nightmare collage. And then came the sound. Not laughter, not music, screams. Human screams. Dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping and echoing as though recorded inside a cavern. Some were high and sharp, others guttural and low, but all carried the same note of agony. I clutched my chest, my body trembling, because I knew these weren't sound effects. These were real. The image shifted, finally landing back on SpongeBob. But he wasn't SpongeBob anymore. His yellow body was torn and warped, his pores stretched open into pits that oozed black liquid. His smile was too wide, stretching ear to ear, showing rows of jagged teeth that had no place on a sponge. And worst of all, his eyes. They weren't animated eyes. They were real, human, bloodshot, wet, rolling in their sockets as they locked directly onto me. For the first time, I realized the cartoon knew I was there. The camera didn't frame him like a character in a scene anymore. It framed him like a predator, staring directly into me. His body leaned forward, closer and closer, until it felt like he was peering through the glass of the television, searching for me specifically. "Why are you still watching?" he whispered. The words weren't shouted. They weren't played for effect. They were spoken with a quiet, almost mournful tone, as if SpongeBob himself pitied me. My breath caught in my throat. My instinct screamed at me to turn off the tape, to run, but I couldn't move. My fingers were cold, locked in place. It felt like if I broke eye contact, something worse would happen. Behind SpongeBob, the rest of the characters began to appear. Squidward, his face sagging, tears streaking down his cheeks. Patrick, glitching in and out of existence, his grin spasming into impossible shapes. Sandy, her helmet cracked, water spilling in and bubbling from her mouth as though she were drowning. They all turned toward the screen, toward me. One by one, their lips moved. "Why are you still watching?" It wasn't synchronized. It wasn't in unison. Each voice overlapped with the others at slightly different times, forming a cacophony of accusation. And yet, beneath the horror, there was a strange familiarity, like they had been waiting for me. The screen flickered, and suddenly I was no longer watching Bikini Bottom. I was in it. The perspective shifted, the camera now placed where I should have been standing. The streets stretched out before me, the buildings decayed and crumbling. The camera bobbed slightly, as though it was following my breath, syncing with the rhythm of my chest. I felt lightheaded, my own breathing falling in time with the screen. A long, distorted laugh broke the silence. Not SpongeBob's usual high-pitched giggle, but something drawn out and garbled, cracking in the middle like a broken tape. SpongeBob stepped forward again, closer, filling the entire screen. "This isn't for you," he hissed. "It was never meant for you." The static surged again, violent this time, cutting the image into jagged shards. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound forced its way in, drilling into my skull. When I opened them again, SpongeBob was closer still, his face pressed so near to the screen that his teeth nearly scraped against it. And then the screen went black. I thought it was over. I prayed it was over. But slowly, faint shapes began to glow in the darkness. White outlines, sketchy and crude, like unfinished animation frames. They flickered across the black, multiplying, surrounding me. I realized they were eyes. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, blinking in and out, all fixed on me. And then, a voice, low, rumbling, not belonging to any character I recognized. "You can't leave now." The eyes grew brighter. Some blinked out, others drew closer, filling the screen until I felt suffocated. And then the voices returned, layered, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My ears rang, my body shaking uncontrollably, every instinct in me screaming to look away. But then SpongeBob spoke again. "Do you remember laughing?" he asked. The question hit me like a blade. Yes, I thought, though I couldn't speak. I remembered being a kid, sitting cross-legged in front of the TV, laughing at his ridiculous antics, at the joy the show used to bring me. His grin widened, splitting his face further, black liquid dripping down his chin. Not anymore. The background erupted. Static gave way to violent, flashing images. Frames of grotesque sea creatures torn apart, human faces stitched into animated bodies, real-life footage of drowned corpses distorted, and twisted into cartoon form. Each flash lasted only a fraction of a second, but the effect was devastating. My brain struggled to process each horrific glimpse, layering them into a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then it stopped. The screen was silent. Black. I sat frozen, my ears ringing. My chest heaved with every shallow breath. I reached for the eject button, my hand trembling, desperate to end it. But before I could touch it, SpongeBob's voice returned. Soft. Close. Don't forget me. The screen flickered one final time, revealing his face. Just his face, staring directly into me with those human eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek, though whether it was animated or real, I couldn't tell. And then, nothing. The tape ended. I stared at the blank screen, my reflection faint in the glass. My skin was pale, my eyes bloodshot, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind my reflection, faint and distorted, I could swear there were other faces staring back. The tape clicked to a stop with a metallic sigh, and for a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to move. My whole body was shaking, hands still frozen inches above the eject button. The screen glowed black, humming faintly with the static electricity of old glass. Finally, I pressed eject. The machine groaned as if reluctant to give it back, then spat the cassette onto the tray. I pulled it out like it was radioactive, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. My chest tightened as I set it down on the coffee table. The room felt wrong. I'd watched horror movies before, even disturbing ones. But this was different. The air itself seemed off, thicker, harder to breathe. The shadows clung to the corners of my apartment like oil. And under it all, a faint vibration buzzed in my ears, like the last echo of static that wouldn't go away. I told myself I'd dreamed half of it, that it was just my imagination layering fears onto a broken tape. But then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on my door. I froze, pulse spiking. Who the hell would be here this late? I didn't move, didn't breathe. My phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up with a text. It was from Mark. Mark, did you watch it? My throat went dry. Mark was the one who'd given me the tape, or at least, I thought he had. But I hadn't told him I'd watched it yet. My fingers hovered over the phone, slick with sweat, before I forced myself to reply. Mia? Why? The typing bubble appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. My phone glitched, the screen flickering as though something was interfering. Finally, a new message came through. Mark, I never gave you a tape. I stared at the words, my heart slamming against my ribs. My memory argued, screaming at me. Yes, he did. He handed it to you. He told you not to play it. Before I could type a response, another knock came at the door. Louder this time. Closer. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. My phone buzzed again. Mark, don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer. I clutched the phone in both hands, shaking. My ears rang, and under that ringing came something worse, a laugh. Soft at first, but growing clearer. That same high-pitched giggle I'd loved as a kid, SpongeBob's laugh. Except now it was stretched, warped, echoing through the walls of my apartment. No, I whispered, covering my ears. No, it's not real. But it was. I could hear it circling me, bouncing from corner to corner, a disembodied mockery of joy. My phone screen flickered again, the text conversation with Mark dissolving into unreadable symbols. For a split second, the background of my messages shifted, not white, but a sponge yellow glow, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I slammed the phone face down, too afraid to look. The knocking stopped. For a long, agonizing silence, the apartment was still. My pulse slowed, though I didn't trust it. Then my laptop, which I hadn't touched all night, chimed. The screen lit up on its own. I swallowed hard, walking toward it like a moth to a flame. The desktop was normal at first, my usual clutter of files, my messy background image. But then I noticed something new. A folder. It hadn't been there before. Its name was short, simple, typed in all caps, SB. My stomach dropped. I hovered the mouse over it, my hand trembling. A part of me wanted to delete it immediately, to pretend it had never appeared. But another part, the same part that made me press play on the tape, was burning with sick curiosity. And then, before I even clicked, the folder opened on its own. Inside were dozens of files. Images, short clips, text documents. Each one named with a different timestamp. Each one matching the exact minutes of my life while I'd been watching the tape. The last file wasn't a clip, though. It was a single still image of me, sitting on my couch, watching the tape. My mouth went dry. My hands shook so violently I could barely close the laptop. The room swam around me, shadows stretching, the faint echo of SpongeBob's laugh still clawing at the edges of my hearing. I should have burned the tape. I should have thrown the laptop out the window. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Because somewhere deep inside, I already knew. This wasn't just a cartoon. It was something else. Something that had followed me out of the screen. And it wasn't finished yet. If this video disappears, you'll know why. I've replayed every second of that night in my head, and nothing makes sense anymore. The tape's gone. I don't even remember throwing it out, but the folder on my laptop keeps coming back, no matter how many times I delete it. Every day, a new file appears. Sometimes it's a sound clip, sometimes an image, and sometimes it's just blank. But I know better than to think it's empty. And here's the part that should terrify you. I don't think you have to watch the tape for it to spread. I think just knowing about it, just hearing these words, is enough to let it in. That laugh I hear late at night, that static ringing in my ears. If you're listening closely right now, don't be surprised if you start hearing it too. So I need your help. Comment if you've ever heard of another episode like this. We need to compare notes, piece together how deep this goes before it's too late. Cartoons are supposed to end with a laugh, but this one is still playing.